Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this live presentation. And I'm really excited to bring to you Deb Dana. And I'm Deborah Wilson, and most of you know me. I'm the founder of School Moves. And the whole idea behind these Think Different webinars is that we can do our work a little bit easier and with support. And I'm bringing in support from the therapy field today, from not the OT-PT therapy field, but the social working field. I'm going to just give you a little introduction of Deb Dana. This is her book, The Polyvagal Theory, and these are my flags.
I love it.
I am
so happy.
Your book just sang to me, and I'm like, oh no, right toward the end, I ran out of flags. I felt like it was such important information for those of us in education. And I feel like you in the social work world probably know all this information more so than we do. And bringing it into education, I think is going to really help us all.
Right.
So, little introduction. Deb Dana is a LCSW, is a clinician and consulting specializing in helping people safely explore and resolve the consequences of trauma. She is the creator of the Rhythm of Regulation training series and teaches internationally on the ways polyvagal theory informs clinical interactions with trauma survivors. Deb co-edited with Stephen Porges, Clinical Applications of the Polyvagal Theory, the Emergence of Polyvagal-Informed Therapies. So welcome, Deb. We've got two Debs here today.
That's right.
And Deb's from my grandparents, lived very close to my grandparents, and we used to visit all the time in Portland, near Portland, Maine. So we're kind of kindred that way. So let's just jump right into this. Tell me a little bit, just how did you get into this? People ask you that a lot, but this is it's kind of intense, this polyvagal theory. The wording is like, I think most of us in teaching would have gone with the rhythm of regulation. Probably.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I read Steve's first book. It was published in 2011. And loved it. I fell in love with it. It just spoke to me. I'm a neuroscience geek anyway. And so when I read it, it was like, oh, this now makes sense. What I'm seeing in my clients makes sense. And so I was working with a team of people, and one of our missions was to bring trainings to Maine. And so I emailed Steve and said, would you like to come to Maine and present a couple days workshop? And he said, I'd love to come to Maine. People love to come to Maine, right? So he said, I would love to come. So he came, and, I jokingly say, that was in 2013. And I jokingly say that our nervous systems fell in love with each other, that we just found he was a kindred spirit, and he was the scientist, and he was looking for ways to get it into the clinical community. And I had been playing around with my mapping and ways of really applying it in everyday therapy. And so we just became good friends. And then, it's gone from there. We've collaborated on the book, and we have a research consortium at the Kinsey Institute. He's the founding director, and I'm the consultant for the consortium. So, a lot of wonderful things came out of an email that said, would you like to come to Maine and present?
That's how it usually happens.
I love it.
I've asked people to take a poll. So let's kind of see how familiar people are with polyvagal theory. Yeah. So far we have 22 votes, 88% say they're brand new.
Oh, beautiful. So welcome. Yes. Yeah, and that sense of paired antagonism, we call it, is the way that the nervous system has been taught for centuries. And Steve's beautiful work really describes that rather than having these two either or responses, there's actually a hierarchy of response. There are three responses. So we still have the two pathways. We have sympathetic, parasympathetic, But the parasympathetic is beautifully divided into two different responses, one being the, love and learn and be here and safe and social. But the other, the ancient pathway of the parasympathetic is the shutdown, collapse, disconnect, become invisible pathway. And that's a pathway that was neglected in the clinical world for a long time. We would see it in our clients, but we couldn't explain it because it doesn't fit with the sympathetic stress response. So learning that, there's this other pathway, which we now can map, because this hierarchy from safe and social, what we're doing right now, being connected, we're in we call it the ventral vagal, safe and social place. And then the next step backwards in the evolution of our nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system, which is a system of mobilization. And when it hijacks us, we're then in fight or flight. And you know that from working with kids, right? You can see fight or flight. That one's easy to see. What the earliest response is this invisible, very quiet, collapsed, sort of fuzzy, foggy, numb place. And that's harder to detect in kids in classrooms. It's easy for we clinicians when we're sitting with clients because you can feel it. But if you have a classroom full of kids, the kid who's sitting in the back quiet is probably not the kid who's getting your attention. Right. And that kid might be perfectly in safe and social ventral vagal engaged and listening and learning, or that kid's system might have taken them into that very quiet, shut down, collapsed place where they're no longer present with you, but they can look like they're there, right?
And that's called the dorsal vagal, right? We use that terminology.
Yes, yeah. We start with that terminology, and I love if everybody on the call can learn that first, and then we give it our own names, because ventral vagal, sympathetic, and dorsal vagal is not quite so user-friendly for families and kids, even for my individual adult clients. So we then ask people to give it their own names. So what would you call, so let's ask you, Deb, what would you call your ventral vagal safe, social, connected place? What name would you give it?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. That's a good question. I've been using ventral vagal, and everybody in my family just rolls their eyes because they don't know what I'm talking about. They're like, oh, well, now what's she talking about? I would just say that's probably my grounded space.
Beautiful. So grounded. Lovely. Yeah. So then if you felt yourself moving backwards along the hierarchy into sympathetic fight flight, what would you call that?
I would say it's like sort of my disintegrated movement. Like I'm moving, but it's just chaos. Yeah. It's chaotic movement, right? I start to clean the house. I start to get stuff out. I'm not sure where I'm going from room to room or what I'm doing, but I have to move.
Right.
That's the big response that I have.
Yeah, and that's a very typical response of the sympathetic nervous system. So when you see people who can't sit still, who have to move, their system is saying, move to be safe. There's danger, so move. So if your ventral is grounded and your sympathetic is chaotic movement, if you go touch into that place of shutdown, collapse, despair, give up, immobilization, what would that place be?
And I've been there. I've been there with my daughter. Everybody on the call knows about Shalia. And as soon as you said that, I went right to when all this news was coming in, this bad news about my daughter, and the neurologist said she'll never walk or talk or function in a meaningful way. She was 5. And he said, I said, but she's doing really well. And he said, well, she's going to go back and regress. So I was like, well, heck, all this work we've all done with her, you mean it's for naught? He said, yeah, she's going to regress back to 2-year-old. And I can remember coming home, and that place for me is just hopeless.
Hopeless, right.
It's that hopeless space. And I always said with my daughter, as long as I had hope and I could see something more I could do and we could keep moving forward, I was okay as a parent.
So when we're in dorsal, we so desperately need another person to come in and be with us, right? Because the dorsal state of despair and hopelessness is one that feels like we're alone and no one will ever find us there. So when a child is in that place, if we can bring a regulated nervous system like you did and just be with, and offer some hugs, some gentle conversation, some reassurance, but not try to move that child out of that state too quickly, because it's a tender process to come out of dorsal, to mobilize and come back to ventral. So we want to take time, and thinking about doing this in a room where you have 24 kids, that's a difficult thing to think about. In a classroom, if we were taking this into a classroom, we might have the teacher present the map and have all the kids get to know their own 3 states and give them a name, right? And then, because it gives us a common language and it gives us a guide. So we have to know what's going on in our nervous system and know where we are in order to know what to do with that, right? The next question is, can somebody in the room who is in ventral go be with each of those people, right?
Because that social connection is just so important, right? The social connection.
So you could do that in a classroom even. You could say, so, is there one of the students who's in ventral, could you go and be with, right? Because it's teaching about social connection, it's teaching about safety, and it's teaching about compassion. Right.
Right. And one of the, when you talked about in your book too, you talked about cues of danger at school. That really struck me, that we assume when a child walks into school, we assume that they feel like they're in a safe place generally. Right. But you talked about how you can do some checks throughout for some of those students.
Right. And, what we're looking for, what our nervous system is always taking in, let's put it that way, because this is we call it neuroception. Neuroception is the nervous system's way of sensing what's happening in the body, in the environment, and between two people in relationship. And that's going on all the time in the background. And then we go in a classroom, and we're often asking kids to be quiet or be still, to not move, right? And becoming quiet, becoming still, without going into the state of feeling immobilized and trapped, is a complicated experience for a nervous system because it's a blended state, right? It's not just ventral vagal, it's ventral vagal with dorsal working together, because dorsal brings us into quiet and ventral makes it safe. Very complicated for a growing nervous system. Right. So
I've never thought of it that way. You're sort of sending mixed neuro messages. We're talking a lot about the students, but Leanna Ray, I know she's chomping at the bit. She's got this in her little chat. I know she's wanting me to say, but it starts with us in co-regulation. Like we have to know where our state is. Right.
And that's the gift of coming to a professional training and learning about your own system. I tell everybody I teach polyvagal from the inside out. You can't learn it from the top down. It's not a cognitive thing. It's a feeling it, experiencing it, making your own maps and knowing where you are. Because our responsibility in the world as professionals, as parents, is to be a regulated and regulating resource for the people around us. Because if a kid is dysregulated, it's because they're getting too many cues of danger. They don't feel safe enough to be there.
Right.
That's really what it's about. So then I can say, what can I do to bring in some cues of
Vera
safety?
she says, I'm happy to share my nervous system. I love it.
Oh,
That is great. So
And I'll bet your students are happy to feel your nervous
Yeah,
system.
she's a pretty
with them.
wonderful therapist. I've known her for a long time. Deb, I know how busy you are. I know you're like an international superhero. So for you to take your time to be here with us just meant so much to all of us in our School Moves communities. So thank you so much.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.